In this section of the course, we're going to go over the layers page of Omnisphere. And this is really the heart of Omnisphere, where you really start making some deep adjustments to the sample, where really most of the control lies. Before we do, however, I wanted to go over a number of interface conventions that Omnisphere or other Spectrasonics highlight in their manual to help you really understand as you go deeper into the interface and just kind of feel a little bit more at home with the controls. Number one is right-click for context, or contextual menu. If you right-click anywhere in the Omnisphere interface, you'll bring up what's known as the contextual menu. And this is a kind of familiar convention in lots of software that's easy to forget about. Many pieces of software have a lot of things under the hood that when you do right-click, you actually gain a lot more control. So this is mainly the same contextual menu in this main window, but you'll find as you go through, say, the browser and other areas that the right-click or contextual menu changes slightly. The next and fairly obvious thing is these drop-down arrows that you see here. That obviously means that there's a deeper menu inside, and that's to be found all over the interface. It might sound obvious, but sometimes it's easy to miss it, you know? This opens up a kind of right-click style contextual menu, whereas this, which we're about to look at now, takes us deep into the instrument. This icon is the zoom icon, and you can see it all over the interface. Now, this one takes us into an entirely different, deeper part of those controls. So, for example, if we go over to modulation here, these are kind of some simple top-level controls about what you've set. And you can control a lot of stuff from here with these kind of drop-down menus. But if you click on this plus button here, which is the zoom icon, we go into the mod matrix zoom. And there's a huge amount of deeper controls here. Similarly with the filter, we get a huge amount of filter controls in the filter zoom, and then the oscillator zoom has many different controls, particularly also with the envelopes. So there's a huge depth to Omnisphere behind this one page here and in other areas. So just remember that the zoom icon takes you much further. In this video, we'll be going over the layers page from this top level, not quite in the zoom level yet. We'll do that in subsequent videos. Next, and probably quite obvious, is anytime you see a folder icon. This means that there is a browsing capability around, and you'll find this in different places. If I switch over to sample here, you can see that down here we've got a folder icon. This means that we're going to be browsing the sound source library inside of the core library. Here we'll be covering the patch library, and here we'll be covering the multi-library. And we kind of looked at this, obviously, in the previous videos. When you're changing a slider, something that's quite obvious, obviously, you can actually right-click and enter the parameter value. So you see now those numbers that were changing when I was just moving the slider above. Now I can actually enter those parameters if I want to be super precise myself. So that's quite useful. Another convention that you'll find is this kind of blue highlighted or blue glowing icon, and this basically shows whenever you see something glowing blue that something is active or selected. You see that we're on layer A here. If we go to layer B and choose a patch, and we go back to A, you see now that B has a blue indicator showing there. And also to the right here we see that the effects, there's a blue indicator, and ARP has a blue indicator. ARP stands for arpeggiator. So we know that there's something going on in layer B, and we know that something's going on in effects and the arpeggiator. We don't know what, we'd have to go into it, but that is quite a useful thing to have in Omnisphere. Down here we can see that with this sample we've got some wave shaper going on it. If we go onto layer B, same with some wave shaper. So it's a very quick way of seeing what's going on. We can see that we're using a filter on this one and a filter on this one. Various different other controls are kind of trying to speak out to us and show us what's going on. The rest of the interface comprises of buttons, knobs, sliders, and switches, and those will be fairly obvious to you. Up and down buttons here to move you through menus, sliders to increase or decrease whatever your parameter is. Same with your knobs here, and various other things. So now that I've got that out of the way, let's initialize this patch so that we can start back from scratch. Remember, initialize patch basically clears everything back to the default state. and that would have cleared layer A, B, C, and D, which is inside this first patch 1 here. So in initializing it, it's taken us back to the main page. I'm going to click on layer A here, and this takes us to the first layer panel for this patch. Of course, if I click on B, it'll take me to the other layer, and C and D, because there are 4 layers inside of this one part or patch. We're just going to be looking at one of these. Obviously, you can see that they're exactly the same between. It's just that whatever your parameters you've set in each one will change. So on the far left, we have a kind of simple thing, which I'm sure you'll know about, but just in case, I'm going to go over it now. So here's my part. This is the default stock sound that Omnisphere comes with. Now, what I can do is I can transpose the whole thing. Here I'm just playing middle C, and I'm transposing the whole thing up or down. And you can, of course, do this 2 octaves high and 2 octaves low. So I did that the wrong way around, but you get what I mean. We have transposing, which is that. Then we have tuning, right? And if you haven't ever heard of coarse or fine tuning, the difference is that coarse tuning is a bit like the transpose function. If I press middle C again, you can hear that it's kind of moving up, not by semitones, but by cents, which are parts of a semitone. Fine would be even finer. So basically, if you want kind of more control over the coarse tuning and greater difference when you move that wheel around, you use coarse, and if you want real fine adjustments, use fine. You'll see there that I just reset that just by clicking, and that's a kind of standard functionality inside of Mac, which is if you hit Command or hold Command rather, and then click a parameter, it'll reset it to its default value. If I click on this, it'll reset. If I move this all the way to here and then Command click, it's going to reset back. The final one then is tracking, and tracking means keyboard tracking. So when you have this on, basically you want to keep this on, almost certainly, unless you're kind of really knowing what you're doing. Basically it means that the pitch of the oscillator will follow the keyboard. In other words, you'll play higher and lower notes. If you turn this off, you won't be able to. So I'm just going to play a simple 5-note scale with it on, and then turn it off. It's just the same note. If you play the same notes, if you play different notes all over the keyboard, it's all the same note. Now that's for the oscillator. What happens if we turn off tracking with a sample? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to press that little indicator icon, and that will turn off layer A. So now, even though I'm playing the keyboard, it's no longer triggering it. If I go over to layer B and click on that part, you'll hear now, if I put tracking back on, that I've loaded up a sample, which is a percussion bottle sound. Okay, now, so you can hear that that's tracking. I can play really low notes and high notes, and it's tracking the sample. The way that keyboard tracking works with samples is that even if you just had one sample, so you recorded the bottle at this pitch, if you turn keyboard tracking on, Omnisphere will automatically put that sample to higher pitches and lower pitches right across the keyboard. But if you turn that off, you just get the original sample on every single key. Here I'm playing all the different notes of the keyboard, and it's just the same sample triggering over and over again. So you might want that off if you were doing, say, a drum sample and you wanted to be able to play multiple notes at the same time with different hands, and it triggered just the same drum pitch. But I would probably advise you, if you're working with Omnisphere, to use it not necessarily for drums. It's not really meant for drums. There are many other instruments, virtual instruments and sampler instruments that are good for using drums. But if you're messing around with it, then at least you know what it's doing. Okay, let's go back over to layer A. I'm going to turn that on and then turn layer B off. So we come to modulation. Each of these, as I said, modulation, oscillator, filter, envelopes, LFOs, will go into more deeply. But for now, we're just going to look at it overall, this layer page. So I'm not going to be clicking on any of these zooms here and going to them in depth. So I won't be going over the fundamentals of synthesis and real kind of long-winded explanations of modulation, filters, envelopes, things like that. I have, if you are a beginner, got an introductory course to sound design and synthesis inside of Logic Instruments, and that's on Udemy. I'll link to that below in the description. But suffice it to say, modulation is kind of the manipulation of sound over time. And we always require a source and a target. So the kind of standard thing that you would do with modulation, the most obvious example which everyone always uses, is a vibrato. So you have a long, steady tone like this. I'm going to change this to a sine so it's less offensive. And our target will therefore be the oscillator's pitch, right? Let's do pitch fine. And so that's the thing that we're going to be changing. We're going to be changing the pitch. That's the target. And the source is going to be an LFO. And you can see that this white line is showing us where the kind of oscillator's value is, and we're manipulating that target. So that's the basis of, or the basics of modulation. We're getting one kind of control here, a low frequency oscillator, which actually is, the controls are down here. We'll go over that another time. And we're controlling the pitch. But if we change that to, say, I don't know, pitch coarse, to make it really, really obvious, you remember that pitch coarse had much greater values when we moved this wheel here, and much finer values when we moved this here. So that's why you have this huge shift in pitch when you're using the LFO to do pitch coarse. That's the basics. To remove modulations, or to kind of select different modulations, we click on this disclosure triangle here, and we can see that there's one modulation routing, which is routing LFO1 to pitch coarse. And we can do a couple of things here. We can remove it or click new modulation routings. And this is a really useful menu. If I open up, say, a patch from the EDM, and let's go for something that's kind of quite complex, perhaps. Oh, wrong one. See how I'm finding complex patches here by clicking through and using our... Let's see what's going on with that one. Now, so I've loaded up a patch. What I want to see is what modulations are going on. Let's click on this here. So now we can see that there are tons of different modulations inside of this patch that have been built in. It's not obvious when you look at this bit here because it's all under the hood. If we were to click on the plus button, we'd see that there's loads of things here, but we're not doing that yet. The quick way of seeing it is by clicking on this disclosure triangle, and we can see that there's all these different things. Now, right now, we don't have any control over those modulations at the top level, but if I click on, say, morphing source, or let's do a simple one, LFO1 to morphing input A, you can now see that I have control over it in the source and target values here. Now, there's two more controls under here, which is mute, so we can turn that off. So if we go back, I'm going to do that again. Forgive me if I don't need to initialize multi, I could have done initialize patch. Let's go back and let's choose sine. Sorry if this is a tiny bit slow for some of you, but repetition is really the mother of skill. So for those of you who are beginners, this might be quite useful for me building this again each time. So what we need to do is we want to kind of change the pitch. So our target is going to be oscillator, pitch fine. Don't worry, we're going to go over all of these, in future in the course. It's, well, pretty much all of them. I say that, there's a ton of stuff in here. It can be really overwhelming when you start doing these things. You open this up and you go, oh my God, how the hell am I going to understand all of this? Don't worry, just take it one thing at a time, you'll get it. So source, LFO1, great, that's working again. So this mute button basically turns off the modulation. You hear each time we just switch back up to the original note. If I was rebuilding this interface, I would probably make sure that that white dot switches back to the middle each time, because it looks like if I mute it here, that the modulation is kind of affected and paused there. It's kind of slightly confusing, but basically it just turns off the whole thing. So that's what mute does. And then invert basically turns it around the other way. So you hear what happened if I had it on normal and I play a note. It starts going up high first, and now it starts going up high and going down. There's not a huge difference with this simple LFO because basically it's a really simple, sine wave shape. But with other modulations, the invert feature is quite useful. It just basically turns it back to front. So if you're still a little bit confused, let me just go over this one more time. So the thing that you modulate, that you move around over time, is the target. This is this thing here. and we can modulate so many different things inside of this place. Here, arpeggiators, we can modulate tons of stuff about the oscillator, we can oscillate filters, we can modulate filters, which we'll do in a second. Those are the targets, those are the things that get moved. But then you have different things that can move them, i.e. you can move them in different ways. We saw a very, very standard low frequency oscillator there, but we can do other things. We can modulate it randomly, or we can modulate it in stepwise motion, or using things called mod envelopes, or we can modulate it using your actual velocity with which you hit the keyboard, and all these other things here. We'll go over those, or as many of them as I can, in some future videos. For now, we'll do one more example of modulation, and then we'll move on to the oscillator. So this would be the most standard thing would be to do kind of an LFO again, to be really, really simple. And what we're going to do is we're going to modulate the cutoff of a filter. Now, if that's gone over your head, don't worry. We're going to be going over filters in a minute and in future videos. Just kind of be interested and understand the modulation side of it, not the filter side of it. So here I'm going to change my target to be filter cutoff, right? And I'm going to change, to make it a little bit more obvious, back to a saw square bright. So I'm just holding one note now, and you can see that the modulation, the LFO, is moving this filter cutoff here, and you can see that the kind of little line on the dial here has gone blue, and that shows you that there's a modulation being applied to it. It's quite useful. And if you right click it, it says you can click on show modulation, and then you see that LFO1 is modulating it. So this is the thing, when I first started using Omnisphere, I was like, oh my god, it's so difficult, like where is everything, how does everything work? If you just go super slowly and you remember that there's kind of these kind of disclosure triangles and these right click points, you can always look back and see, okay, what's actually going on here. And when we look and kind of deconstruct kind of fully made patches in future, you'll see that that's really what I'm doing all the time. I'm kind of clicking on stuff and going, what's going on there? Show modulation, LFO1. Okay, interesting. So that's that one there. And your brain slowly starts to get a sense of like how all of this is fitting together. And then that in turn goes into your own understanding about how to build interesting patches. One final thing that I realized I didn't go over earlier, which is this actual slider here. So you can hear that the depth of this cutoff is it goes so deep that we lose the sound pretty much, right? But basically this slider here, the target slider, and where this cutoff is, which is being controlled by this LFO, is linked. So if I just watch as I move this slider and this, watch that knob there. Okay, so I'm going to move this up. You can see what we're doing is we're changing the target, and you can see in the background here, because of the depth of the depth of our LFO, we'll look at that later, we can see there's a blue area moving in which this this white dot is moving, and this is showing us that the extent of our modulation. And if you listen now, the sound of the LFO affecting the cutoff is different. You hear that actually we hear the sound the whole time, right? And if we pull this back down again, so the cutoff goes right down to the bottom of the LFO, we're back to where we were. Okay, cool. So let's leave that behind and let's move on to the oscillator.